Hello and welcome, everyone. We are just a few days away from Father's Day, and I don't know about you, but we've been getting things ready to host a big family dinner on Sunday. My husband is famous for making smoked brisket, so that is in the fridge and it's marinating, and I'm so excited. Anyways, earlier this week, I was in the store looking at Father's Day cards with my son. And we were laughing as we were looking at all of the different cards because they all seem to revolve around the same handful of themes. It's grilling, it's golfing, it's fishing, it's tools in the garage, it's falling asleep in the recliner and snoring. There were cards about thermostats and lawn care, and cards about cargo shorts and refusing to ask for directions. The dad stereotype game around Father's Day is strong. And honestly, whether they're accurate or not, most of us immediately recognize those stereotypes. We all know that dad, or maybe we have that dad, or maybe if we're being honest, we're married to that dad, or you are that dad, right? So as I stood there reading these cards, I started thinking about how interesting it is that fatherhood does seem to come with its own set of cliches. There are things that dads are known for doing. And then there are the things dads are known for saying. Because somehow dads everywhere seem to share the same vocabulary. And I don't think anybody consciously teaches them these phrases, but generation after generation across languages and cultures and backgrounds, dads end up saying really similar things. Turn off the lights. No one touches the thermostat because I said so. Of course, I'm not lost. It's almost as if becoming a father unlocks these phrases that have been passed down for generations. And we've all heard them. But there's something super interesting about these things that dads say. Because even though they make us laugh, or more often they just make us roll our eyes, they're not just words. Hidden inside of them are values and beliefs and life lessons and fears and hopes and attempts to teach us and protect us. And I wonder if sometimes they're reminders of emotional tools that other generations have had or didn't have available to them. These little phrases get repeated so often that they almost become background noise when we're growing up. And then one day, usually much later when we are parents, we find ourselves saying them. Or we suddenly understand what they meant when they said it. Or we decide that we're going to keep the value of what our dad said, but maybe we're going to update the delivery of it. So, in honor of Father's Day, I thought it would be fun to take a closer look at some of these classic dad-isms, the phrases that dads say in families everywhere, and explore what might actually be hiding underneath them. Because as it turns out, there's often a lot more wisdom and history packed into these little one liners than we think. So let's start with maybe one of the most famous dad phrases of all time, because I said so. I don't know that there has ever been a phrase more universally disliked by children. As kids, it feels like the ultimate conversation ender. And it's frustrating because it doesn't matter what the question was, it doesn't explain the reasoning, it doesn't satisfy our curiosity. There's no evidence or logic or data behind it. It is just the end of it. And when you were younger, you probably thought to yourself, when I'm a parent, I am never going to say that. I know, but I said the same thing. I really wanted to be the parent who explained things and had good reasons for every decision. And then I became a parent. And somewhere between explaining why we have to wear seatbelts, why we don't hit our siblings, why bedtime exists, why, I started to understand what it feels like to not want to explain, to just end the back and forth because parenting happens in real time and there isn't always time for energy or debate. I don't want to negotiate. I don't want to outline my reasons. Sometimes the answer is simply because I said so. Now, I don't think that means that it's the ideal response every time. Children absolutely benefit from understanding the why behind limits and expectations. Understanding builds trust and helps our kids act from values instead of just training them to comply with rules. And the more I've learned, the more I've realized that this phrase probably wasn't about control as much as I thought it was as a child. Sometimes it was about responsibility, or because the reason was just too complicated for me to understand, or maybe they were just tired and didn't want to talk. And sometimes I think it might have been because they just didn't have a good reason. Maybe they didn't know why they were doing what they were doing or why they were saying no. They just were repeating patterns that they had learned. And I have so much more compassion for that now. I think one of the interesting shifts that we see in modern parenting is this desire to move away from that authority based parenting and more toward relationship based parenting. And in many ways, that's a really beautiful thing. We want our children to feel heard and we want them to understand. We want to collaborate when it's appropriate. But I also think it's possible that we have stepped into a little bit of fear of taking a leadership role. Like every decision has to be justified or explained, or that every limit can be negotiated and every boundary has to be approved by the family committee. And that's not actually healthy either. Children need connection, but they also need leadership, which is why I think many of us have taken the value behind this phrase and updated how we say it. So instead of saying, because I said so, we might start saying things like, let me explain why. Or I know you don't like this decision, but the answer is still no. It's the same leadership, but it's different language around it. And it feels very different when we say it. And maybe that's one of the things that we'll come back to as we look at some of these other things that dads say, that sometimes the phrase itself isn't the point. The deeper question is, what is the value underneath it? Because that's what often is worth keeping, even if we choose to say it in a different way. Okay. So if because I said so is the most famous dad phrase of all time, then turn off the lights has to be a close second. In fact, I think there's a moment in every dad's life when they unknowingly cross this invisible line. Because one day you're just a boy walking out of a room without a second thought. And the next day you're standing in the hallway wondering why every light in the house is on. And you start muttering things that you'd never thought you'd say. Does anybody know how to turn off a light? Why is the bathroom light on? Who left the kitchen light on? And suddenly you find something horrifying. You have become your father. We laugh at my husband all the time for saying this exact thing. Like, of all the things that are going on and even going wrong in our house, why is this the hill that he's willing to die on? The dishes can be piled up to here, the laundry can be overflowing, and any number of horrible things can be going on in our house, but heaven forbid someone leave a light on in an empty room. It seems to me like such a small thing, but of course, the light itself is not usually the point. The light is just the visible thing. What so many dads are actually trying to teach here is so much deeper. It's responsibility, it's stewardship, it's awareness, it's taking care of the things that take care of you because resources matter and they come at a cost. Not just the literal financial cost, but the sacrifice it takes to provide those resources work, time, money. So, of course, it's frustrating to see wasted food, wasted electricity, wasted water dripping down the drain. It's about respect and appreciation for what's been worked for and provided to you. I think this is one of those places where the issue becomes less about the specific behavior and more about the principle that's underneath it. Because every family has their version of turn off the lights. Maybe it's not wasting gas in the car or eating the food that's in the fridge. The actual task is almost irrelevant. It doesn't matter. What we're really trying to teach is awareness, the understanding that we live in a shared environment and that our choices affect other people. Now, when we're kids, these reminders feel an awful lot like nagging. But when we're adults, we begin to see that so much of successful adulthood is built on small acts of responsibility that no one is going to congratulate you for. Nobody gives you a trophy for turning off the lights. Nobody posts on social media because you remembered to fill the gas tank or put your dishes in the sink. And yet it's those tiny, ordinary acts that make homes function. They're what make relationships function and communities function. And I think that's why this phrase has survived for generations. Not because dads are secretly obsessed with electricity, although I think some of them might be. My husband might be. But because they understand something that we don't always see yet, and that is that life is built on these small habits, not big grand gestures or occasional bursts of effort. Small habits repeated consistently over time. And maybe that's why so many of us eventually find ourselves saying the exact same thing. Not because we're worried about the electric bill, maybe, maybe a little bit, but because we've come to understand what our parents were trying to teach all along, that the light was never really the lesson. The lesson was learning to notice, the small things and show respect for what's being provided, especially those little things we take for granted. Okay, this last one is universal because every dad, and honestly, every mom, has a story that begins with the words, well, when I was your age, or back in my day. Okay. As kids, these stories can be exhausting. Let's be honest. When you're 12 and frustrated because your phone isn't working, the last thing you want to hear is a story about how your dad didn't even have a phone when he was growing up. When you're complaining about homework, you don't necessarily appreciate hearing about how he had to do all his research using a physical encyclopedia in a library he had to ride his bike to. At the time, in those moments, it can kind of feel like a competition. Like your struggle is being compared to someone else's struggle, and it's not struggly enough. And the message you're left with is, you think you have it hard? Let me tell you about hard. But I don't think, at least from my perspective, when I know that I do this all the time, and I don't think that we're trying to win a suffering contest when we open up the old memory vault. I think what they're trying to offer, what we're trying to offer as parents, is perspective. The challenge is that perspective is a gift that nobody wants in the moment. When we're struggling, we usually just want understanding before we want perspective. So sometimes the message gets lost. But if we look at our dads and what they're trying to say underneath that phrase, I think they're trying to communicate something that helped them navigate their own lives. Maybe the message was actually that you can survive hard things, or that discomfort isn't always an emergency, or that challenges don't mean failure. Our parents grew up in very different circumstances in a very different world than what we have experienced, and so did we. Our children have different expectations and opportunities and challenges and resources. But whether the experiences of the past were objectively harder or simply different isn't really the point. The point is that those experiences shaped our parents and they shaped us and taught us lessons, and we want to pass those lessons on. The problem is that wisdom doesn't easily transfer from one generation to the next because every generation faces challenges that the last one doesn't understand. Just like today's kids may struggle to appreciate what life looked like decades ago, parents sometimes struggle to understand their kids too. And even though it seems like everything changes, the desire behind the message is the same. We want our kids to believe they can handle hard things. We want our children to develop resilience, and we want our children to build enough trust in themselves that they can get through the things that are difficult. And I think that's often what is hiding underneath those stories. Not necessarily, I had it worse than you, but I've done hard things, and so can you. Of course, it's cliche, but my husband says these things all the time, and I do too. And I'm not trying to prove anything. Okay. It's because there are moments when I genuinely want my kids to understand that what feels impossible today may be a story they tell their kids someday. Okay. Also, that we have more in common than we think. Even though I don't understand exactly what they're going through, I have been through some stuff and I might have something to offer in this situation. And maybe that's why this phrase and these stories have survived for so long. Not because dads and moms love talking about themselves, although occasionally that might be true, but I think it's because they just want to be relevant and stay connected and feel seen because they weren't always just a dad, right? One time they were cool and one time they were relevant and important and did cool things. All right. I know that we can list off so many more phrases that we hear our dads say all the time. Money doesn't grow on trees. Oh, you're bored? I'll give you something to do. I'm not lost. I know exactly where we are. There are so many. But the point is that too often, I think we're just hearing the words. We hear the annoyance. We hear the lecture we've heard 100 times before. We roll our eyes at the cringy dad jokes. We hear those words, but we don't stop to consider what's really being communicated. And when I look at the dads that I've known, my own dad, my grandpa, my brothers, my husband, I don't think they're just trying to leave a collection of memorable one liners. I think that they're trying to teach and guide and lead with the tools they have available to them. And sometimes that tool is wisdom. Sometimes it's humor or what they think is humor. Sometimes it's a habit that's passed down from generations of dads before them. And sometimes it's words that probably sounded a lot better in their heads than they did coming out of their mouths. Because a lot of times, these phrases and tropes that we can laugh at on Father's Day actually land like a lead balloon. But sometimes they stick. And we're all trying to communicate something bigger than the words that we have available to us. We're trying to pass along values and character and perspective and life lessons. And sometimes those things do get wrapped up in ordinary sentences that just become part of the soundtrack of our childhood. Phrases that we swore we would never say, but eventually seem to find their way into our own vocabulary too. Not because we've become our parents, at least not entirely, but because we're standing in a similar position now. We're carrying the responsibilities that maybe we didn't understand before. We're trying to teach the lessons that can only really be understood by experience. And we're trying to navigate a world that feels so similar and yet so different from the one that we grew up in. And maybe that's one of the most humbling parts of becoming an adult. You start to realize that your parents were just figuring it out too, maybe with far better intentions than you could see at the time. So, on this Father's Day, I wonder what phrases come to mind when you think about your dad. Maybe it's one that made you laugh, or maybe it's one that drove you absolutely crazy. And maybe it's one that still echoes in your mind even years later. Maybe it's one you've caught yourself saying recently and immediately thought, oh no, it's happening. I've become my dad. Whatever phrase comes to your mind, I hope you'll take a moment to think about what was underneath it, the lesson, the value, the love. Because sometimes the things that shape us aren't the big speeches or the life changing moments. Sometimes they're just the one liners we've heard so many times that they become a part of who we are. Whether those words make you smile or roll your eyes or laugh out loud, they're part of the story of how one generation tries to pass something meaningful on to the next. So, to all the dads out there, happy Father's Day. I hope the steaks are tender. I hope the lights are turned off. And for heaven's sakes, please close the door so you don't have to cool off the whole neighborhood. I would love for you to share some of the phrases that remind you of your dad. So drop those in the comments. Thank you all so much for being here. I will see you again next week, where we'll continue to explore the art and science of parenting and put your parenting to the test. Take care, everyone.